Have you ever wondered what happens when warriors bred for centuries in the harshest deserts of the Southwest are unleashed on the battlefields of Europe? What becomes of men whose ancestors perfected the art of silent killing, of tracking enemies across impossible terrain, of disappearing into landscapes that offered no cover? The answer lies buried in classified military documents, in the trembling testimonies of German soldiers who survived encounters they still cannot explain, and in the hushed conversations of American officers who witnessed something that was never meant to be weaponized on a modern battlefield. Before we dive into this story that the military tried to erase from history, I need you to do something. Comment below where you are watching this from. Are you from Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, or somewhere else entirely? Let me know. And if you value content like this, content that uncovers the secrets they don't want you to know, please subscribe. This channel needs your support to keep bringing these hidden truths to light. Now, let's begin. The spring of 1918 brought an unusual request to the desk of General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces in France. The request came not from another general, not from Washington, not even from the Allied command. It came from a Cherokee liaison officer named Thomas Whitefeather, who had been quietly studying casualty reports and battle effectiveness statistics since American forces first arrived in Europe. His analysis revealed something that military strategists had overlooked in their focus on trenches, poison gas, and artillery barrages. Whitefeather had identified a pattern in the limited success of American reconnaissance units, and his solution was both brilliant and terrifying. He wanted to recruit Apache scouts, not just any Apache. Whitefeather's memo, now sealed in a classified archive at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, specifically requested men from the San Carlos Reservation, from the White Mountain communities, from the families of warriors who had fought against the United States Army less than 30 years earlier. Men whose fathers had ridden with Geronimo. Men who had been raised with stories of Cochise, of Victorio, of battles fought with such ferocity that even hardened cavalry officers had nightmares about them decades later. The memo's final line would prove prophetic in ways Whitefeather could not have imagined. These men know how to make fear a weapon. The recruitment drive began in May of 1918, conducted with unusual discretion. Regular Army recruiters were specifically excluded. Instead, the task fell to a mixed team of Cherokee, Comanche, and Navajo officers who traveled to the reservations with a message that resonated with men who had seen their way of life systematically destroyed. Here was a chance to prove their worth as warriors again, to show that Apache fighting methods were not relics of a bygone era, but tools that could turn the tide of a modern war. 27 men volunteered in the first week. By the end of the month, 68 Apache warriors had committed to what the Army would officially designate as Special Reconnaissance Unit 17. The commanding officer assigned to Unit 17 was Captain Robert Mackenzie, a West Point graduate whose grandfather had fought against the Apache in Arizona. His private journals, discovered in 1973 in a storage unit in San Antonio, reveal his initial skepticism about the entire operation. I am being asked to command men whose ancestors killed more American soldiers per capita than any other native group. Men who are legendary for their ability to inflict terror. The irony of asking them to fight for the same government that destroyed them is not lost on me. I am certain this will end in disaster. But Mackenzie was thorough, and he was curious. Before the unit shipped to France, he spent 6 weeks training with his men in the Arizona desert. What he learned during those weeks changed his perspective entirely, and, according to his journals, gave him nightmares for the rest of his life. The Apache warriors demonstrated tracking skills that seemed supernatural. They could identify individual soldiers by their footprints, could estimate how long ago someone had passed by examining crushed grass, could predict movement patterns by reading terrain with an accuracy that exceeded anything Mackenzie had learned at the academy. But it was their approach to combat that truly disturbed him. "They do not see killing as warfare," Mackenzie wrote in an entry dated June 19, 1918. "They see it as hunting. There is no anger, no passion, no hatred, just efficiency. A German soldier to them is no different than a deer or an elk, something to track, to outsmart, to bring down as quietly as possible. But there is something else, something I cannot quite name. When they talk about their ancestors, about the warriors who fought my grandfather, their eyes change. It is not pride exactly. It is more like they are channeling something, connecting to something that exists outside of time. Sergeant Nantage told me yesterday, we carry old hate, not our hate. The hate of men who died fighting. That hate never dies. It waits." I asked him what it waits for. He smiled and said, "For permission to come out." Unit 17 arrived in France in July of 1918 and was immediately assigned to the Saint-Mihiel sector, where American forces were preparing for a major offensive. The Apache warriors were distributed in small teams across various infantry divisions, with orders to conduct reconnaissance, gather intelligence, and when possible, eliminate enemy sentries and forward observers without alerting German positions. The official military histories mention Unit 17 only in passing, as a specialized indigenous reconnaissance element. But the reports filed by infantry commanders who worked alongside the Apache scouts tell a very different story. Lieutenant Colonel James Hartford of the 26th Infantry Division filed the first disturbing report on July 29, 1918. His unit had been ordered to probe German defenses near Seicheprey, a task that had cost them dearly in previous attempts. Hartford was given a team of 4 Apache scouts led by a warrior named Victorio Esquiminzin, a man in his early 30s whose father had been captured during the Geronimo campaign. What Hartford witnessed during the 3-day mission would haunt him for decades. "I have commanded men in battle for 12 years, Hartford wrote in his official report. "I have seen acts of exceptional bravery and witnessed the full spectrum of human behavior under fire. Nothing prepared me for what I observed with the Apache team. They did not behave like soldiers. They behaved like predators who had found prey they had been waiting their entire lives to hunt." On the first night, Esquiminzin and his men crossed into German-held territory with no discussion, no planning session, no coordination with our forces. They simply vanished into darkness. At 0300 hours, I heard sounds from the German trenches. Not gunfire, not shouts, just screams. Brief, terrified screams that were cut short. Then silence. Hartford's report continues with increasing disturbance. At dawn, Esquiminzin returned. His men were covered in mud and blood. None of them appeared wounded. Esquiminzin handed me a map he had drawn during the night, showing German trench positions, machine gun nests, artillery placements, supply routes, and command posts. The detail was extraordinary. I asked him how he had gathered this intelligence. He said, "We walked through them." I said that was impossible, that German lines were heavily defended, that sentries would have raised alarms. He looked at me with something in his eyes that made my skin crawl. He said, 23 sentries, all sleeping now, forever sleeping." I realized then what the screams had been. But it was Hartford's next observation that would become the pattern for all future reports about Unit 17. I ordered my men forward to verify the intelligence. We found the German trenches exactly as mapped. We also found the sentries. They had been killed, but not in any manner I have witnessed in this war. No bullet wounds, no bayonet marks. Their throats had been opened with such precision that several appeared to have died without making a sound. But it was what had been done after death that disturbed my men most. Symbols had been carved into their foreheads, ancient symbols that none of us recognized. When I confronted Eskiminsen about this, he said, "We marked them so their spirits would know who killed them, so the hate would follow them into the dark." The Apache teams were rotated through multiple divisions during August and September of 1918. Each unit that worked with them filed similar reports. The warriors conducted reconnaissance missions with impossible success rates. They infiltrated German positions that had been considered impenetrable. They eliminated targets with silent efficiency that bordered on supernatural. And they always left marks on the bodies. Symbols that German intelligence officers began to recognize and fear. A captured German diary, found near Verdun in September of 1918, provides a chilling perspective from the other side. The diary belonged to Oberst Wilhelm Hessler, a decorated officer commanding a battalion of the 67th Infantry Regiment. His entries from late August reveal a growing terror that had nothing to do with artillery or gas attacks. August 24th. 3 sentries did not report at dawn. Found their bodies at the wire. Their throats had been opened ear to ear, so cleanly that no blood had been heard dripping. But it was the marks on their foreheads that disturbed the men. Strange symbols, cut deep. The soldiers are saying the Americans have brought devils from their western territories. I have ordered extra sentries, doubled patrols. We must stop these night killings. August 27th. 7 more men dead. Found them in the supply trench, all killed within minutes of each other. Yet no one heard anything. How is this possible? The marks on their foreheads are always the same. My men are refusing to stand sentry duty. They say the marks are curses, that the spirits of dead warriors are hunting us. I have shot 2 men for desertion. Others are sleeping in groups, afraid to be alone. Morale is collapsing. September 2nd. It is worse than I thought. I sent a patrol to investigate reports of movement in the destroyed village of Montsec. Only 1 man returned. He was hysterical, incomprehensible. He kept saying, "Shadows with eyes, shadows with knives." But we found the others strung up in the village church, all marked with the symbols. But this time there was more. Words had been written on the wall in blood, in English. Geronimo remembers. What does this mean? Who is Geronimo? My men are calling these Americans Gespenstkrieger, ghost warriors. I have requested transfer of my entire battalion. Hessler's diary ends on September 6th with a final, barely legible entry. They came for me last night. I heard nothing, felt a hand on my throat, saw eyes in the darkness, eyes that reflected light, like an animal's eyes. Then pain. I woke to find my orderly standing over me, trying to stop the bleeding. The mark is on my forehead now. I can feel it burning. They left me alive deliberately. They want me to spread the fear. God in heaven, what have the Americans brought to this war? By mid-September, reports about Unit 17 had reached General Pershing's headquarters. The success rate was undeniable. Areas where Apache scouts operated saw dramatic decreases in German resistance, entire units abandoning positions rather than face night raids by the ghost warriors. But the methods employed were becoming problematic. Allied commanders from Britain and France were filing complaints about the barbaric practices of American indigenous units. There were calls for investigations, for courts-martial, for immediate disbandment of all native combat teams. Captain Mackenzie was summoned to Paris on September 18th to explain Unit 17's operations. His testimony, given before a closed tribunal of senior Allied officers, was sealed for 60 years and only declassified in the 1970s. The transcript reveals Mackenzie defending his men while struggling with his own growing unease about what he had created. "Gentlemen, you must understand what these men represent," Mackenzie testified. "They are not savages playing at war. They are warriors from a culture that perfected guerrilla warfare over centuries, a culture that fought the United States Army to a standstill for decades, despite being outnumbered 100 to 1. When we recruited them, we told them to use their traditional methods. We gave them permission to be what they are, what they have always been. We cannot now condemn them for being too effective." A French general interrupted, according to the transcript. "Captain, effectiveness is not the issue. The issue is the psychological warfare they are employing. The symbols carved into corpses, the ritualistic displays, the deliberate spreading of terror. This goes beyond military necessity. This is revenge." Mackenzie's response would prove prophetic. "Sir, with all respect, it is not revenge. Revenge implies anger about something that happened to you personally. What Unit 17 is expressing is something older and deeper than revenge. It is what they call old hate, the accumulated rage of generations who were hunted, killed, dispossessed, and broken. For 30 years, that hate had nowhere to go. It was suppressed, buried, denied. We gave it permission to emerge. We aimed it at Germans instead of at ourselves. And now, you want to know if we can control it?" Mackenzie paused, according to the transcript, before delivering his final observation. "Gentlemen, I no longer believe we ever controlled it at all." The tribunal ordered Unit 17 to be withdrawn from frontline operations immediately. But the order arrived too late. On September 28, 1918, the German army began a massive retreat across the entire Western Front, abandoning positions they had held for years. Allied forces, including American units, advanced rapidly into territory that had been considered impregnable. They found thousands of abandoned weapons, supplies, and equipment. They also found something else. In village after village, town after town, they discovered German soldiers who had not retreated. Men who had been killed in their sleep, in their command posts, in their bunkers, all of them marked with the same symbols on their foreheads. All of them killed with precision and silence that defied explanation. Estimates vary, but intelligence reports suggest that between 300 and 500 German soldiers were killed in this manner during the final month of the war. None of the killings were officially attributed to Unit 17. Indeed, official records state that the Apache scouts had been withdrawn from combat operations on September 25th. But Captain Mackenzie's private journal tells a different story. His final entries, written in October and November of 1918, reveal a man who had lost control of his command, and possibly his sanity. October 2nd. I cannot find them. Sergeant Nantage and his team have not reported in 6 days. They were supposed to return to base camp after the tribunal's order. Instead, they disappeared into the chaos of the German retreat. I have reports of American soldiers who claim to have seen them, always at night, always moving east, always hunting. They are not following orders anymore. I am not sure they care about the war anymore. They have found something here, something they needed, a way to release everything that was done to them, to their fathers, to their people. I think they plan to continue until they are stopped. October 9th. More reports. German prisoners are talking about the Geisterkrieger spreading across the battlefield. They say the warriors move like smoke, kill like lightning, and leave marks that curse the dead. French intelligence brought me a captured German document, a warning distributed to their troops. It describes Apache warriors by name. It tells soldiers to surrender rather than fight at night. It admits that conventional defenses are useless against them. I showed this to Major Whitefeather. He said, "They are doing what warriors do. They are counting coup. They are earning their place in the stories that will be told." I asked if he could stop them. He said, "Would you stop a wildfire by talking to it?" October 27th. The war is ending. Armistice rumors are everywhere. But Unit 17 has not returned. I received a message today, delivered by a Navajo code talker. Just one sentence. "We finish when we finish." I don't know what that means. I don't know if they will ever come back. Part of me hopes they don't. Part of me is terrified of what they have become out there. The armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918. The guns fell silent across the Western Front. Soldiers on both sides celebrated, wept, prayed. The Great War was over. But for Unit 17, the war continued for 3 more weeks. They returned to American lines on December 2nd, 1918, all 68 men who had originally deployed. No casualties, not a single wounded soldier. They looked thinner, harder, older. Their uniforms were torn and stained. Their weapons were pristine, and their eyes, according to multiple witnesses, had changed in a way that no one could quite describe, but everyone noticed. Captain Mackenzie met them at the base camp near Verdun. He had prepared a speech, a reprimand for their insubordination, a demand for explanations. He never delivered it. When Sergeant Nantage stepped forward, Mackenzie saw something in his face that made all words die in his throat. "We are done," Nantage said simply. "Old hate is satisfied. We can go home now." Mackenzie wanted to ask what they had done during those 3 extra weeks. He wanted to know how many more they had killed. He wanted to understand what satisfied meant. But he was afraid of the answers, so he just nodded and signed the papers that would send Unit 17 back to the United States. The official records state that Special Reconnaissance Unit 17 was disbanded in January of 1919. All members returned to their reservations. All were honorably discharged. All were awarded medals for exceptional service. The complete operational history of the unit remains classified to this day. The official explanation is that Unit 17's methods involved intelligence-gathering techniques that are still considered sensitive. But there are other documents, harder to find, that tell a different story. Medical records from the San Carlos Reservation in 1919 and 1920 describe treating former members of Unit 17 for what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Not the trauma of being victims, the trauma of having been predators. The reservation doctors noted that the veterans refused to speak about their service, had violent nightmares, and often woke screaming words in German. A letter written in 1923 by a doctor named Samuel Bridger describes one particularly disturbing case. "I have been treating Victorio Escaminzin for 4 years since his return from France. He barely sleeps. When he does, he relives the killings. But here is what troubles me most. He does not relive them with horror or guilt. He relives them with satisfaction. He told me yesterday, 'Every night I count them again. Every throat opened, every mark carved, every face that looked at me with terror before the darkness took them. I count them like counting coup, like my ancestors counted their victories. And when I reach the end of the count, I feel what my grandfather never felt. I feel like the debt is a little smaller.' I asked, 'What debt?' He said, 'The debt they owe us for everything they took. We can never make them pay it all. But we made them pay some. We made them know what it feels like to be hunted in your own land. The pattern repeated across all the veterans. They had not fought for America. They had fought for themselves, for their ancestors, for the generations who had been destroyed. Germany had simply been a convenient target, a way to channel rage that had no other outlet. The war had given them permission to be what the United States government had spent decades trying to eliminate: Apache warriors at the height of their power, hunting enemies without restraint. Captain Robert Mackenzie returned to the United States in 1919. He never spoke publicly about Unit 17. He left the Army in 1920 and became a history professor at the University of New Mexico. His classes on frontier warfare were considered brilliant but disturbing. Students described him as a man haunted by something he could not or would not explain. In 1947, Mackenzie's house in Albuquerque burned down under circumstances that were never fully explained. He was 71 years old. Fire investigators found his body in his study, along with boxes of documents that had been deliberately doused with gasoline before the fire started. Only a few pages survived, fragments of his journals describing Unit 17. The final legible passage, dated sometime in the 1940s, reveals a man still struggling with what he had witnessed nearly 30 years earlier. I have spent decades trying to understand what happened in France, trying to rationalize what I saw, what I commanded, what I enabled. But I realize now that understanding is impossible, because what happened was not rational. It was primal. We took men whose entire culture had been built on warfare, men whose ancestors had fought with such ferocity that they became legends, and we told them to kill our enemies. We thought we could aim their violence like a weapon. We thought we could control the hate. We were fools. You cannot control hate that old, that deep, that justified. You can only point it in a direction and pray it stops when the target is gone. But what if it doesn't stop? What if it just waits for the next target? The documents that survived the fire in Mackenzie's home eventually found their way to a military historian named Dr. Patricia Chenol, who began investigating Unit 17 in the 1980s. What she discovered suggested that Mackenzie's fears about the hate not stopping were not paranoid delusions, but prescient warnings about something that continued long after the war ended. Chenol obtained access to sealed medical records from multiple reservations through a Freedom of Information Act request that took 7 years to process. What she found was a pattern that had been deliberately obscured. Between 1919 and 1935, 41 of the 68 veterans from Unit 17 died under unusual circumstances. 17 were officially listed as accidents. 12 were listed as suicides. 9 died from unexplained illnesses that doctors described as failure to thrive. 3 simply disappeared and were never found. But it was the notes attached to these records that revealed something darker. The reservation doctors who treated these men before their deaths consistently mentioned the same symptoms: nightmares that grew worse over time instead of better, an inability to reintegrate into reservation life, violent episodes triggered by seemingly random events, and, most disturbing, an obsessive need to continue counting, though the doctors could never determine what was being counted. One doctor, a Cherokee physician named Thomas Wolfe, who worked at the San Carlos Reservation from 1920 to 1938, kept detailed private notes that his grandson donated to the Smithsonian in 2003. These notes paint a picture of men who had been fundamentally changed by their experiences in France, transformed in ways that made peaceful existence impossible. July 1921. Saw Nantage today. He is deteriorating rapidly. His hands shake constantly. He barely eats. But the most concerning development is what he told me about the marks. The symbols they carved into German soldiers were not random, as I had assumed. They were specific Apache war symbols, each one carrying meaning, each one a message. But Nantage claims they were also something else. Anchors, he called them. Ways to tie the dead to the living world. Ways to prevent their spirits from finding peace. I asked why they would do such a thing. His response chilled me. Because we wanted them to stay angry. We wanted them to be ghosts who would haunt their own people. We wanted Germany to be cursed with the spirits of their dead, just as our land is cursed with the spirits of ours. I am beginning to believe these men brought something back from Europe that goes beyond battlefield trauma. Dr. Wolf's notes continue through the 1920s, documenting the slow dissolution of Unit 17's survivors. But in 1929, the notes take an alarming turn. Several veterans, including Vittorio Eskiminzen, began reporting that they were being visited by something. Not memories, not hallucinations. Visitors. March 1929. Eskiminzen came to my office in a state of extreme agitation. He claims he saw a German soldier standing outside his home 3 nights ago. Not a real soldier. A spirit soldier, still wearing his uniform from the war, still bearing the mark on his forehead that Eskiminzen himself had carved. I attempted to explain this as a trauma response, but Eskiminzen insisted it was real. He said, "I cursed them to be ghosts. Now they are, but they are not German ghosts anymore. They are here. They followed us home." I asked what he meant by here. He said, "Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma. Everywhere we went. The ghosts we made are collecting, growing stronger. They want to understand what was done to them. They want to learn our hate so they can use it." This is clearly psychosis, but the specificity of the delusion is disturbing. By 1930, at least 12 veterans from Unit 17 were reporting similar experiences. They saw German soldiers in traditional Apache territories. They heard German voices mixed with Apache chants. They found objects that should not exist in the American Southwest. German uniforms, German weapons, German identity papers, all appearing in caves, in abandoned buildings, in sacred sites. The reservation authorities dismissed these reports as mass hysteria, a shared delusion among traumatized veterans. But Dr. Wolf was not convinced. He began his own investigation and discovered something that the authorities had missed. The locations where these German ghosts were being sighted were not random. They corresponded exactly to sites where Apache warriors had fought their last battles against the United States Army in the 1880s and 1890s. November 1930. I have mapped every reported sighting. The pattern is undeniable. The German spirits, if that is what they are appearing at battlefields where Apache blood was spilled. Cibecue Creek, Big Dry Wash, Skeleton Canyon. Places where Apache warriors died fighting an enemy that outnumbered them impossibly. It is as if the trauma of those defeats has created a resonance. And the newer trauma, the German deaths marked by Apache hands, is somehow connecting to it. Nantage told me something yesterday that I cannot stop thinking about. He said, "We took German souls, and we marked them with Apache signs. We made them Apache ghosts. Now they are waking up in Apache land, carrying Apache hate, but with German memories. We created something that should not exist. Ghosts that belong to 2 peoples, 2 lands, 2 wars." In 1932, the situation escalated dramatically. 3 hikers from Phoenix disappeared in the Superstition Mountains east of the city. When search teams found their bodies 6 days later, the circumstances were bizarre. They had been killed with precision, their throats opened ear to ear, exactly like the German soldiers in France. But these victims were American civilians, with no connection to the military or to the Apache reservations. The investigation was brief and inconclusive. The official determination was animal attack, despite forensic evidence that clearly showed knife wounds. But there was one detail that never made it into official reports. All 3 victims had symbols carved into their foreheads, the same symbols that Unit 17 had used in France 14 years earlier. Dr. Wolf learned about the case from a Phoenix detective named Marcus Brennan, who had served in France during the war and recognized the symbols from intelligence briefings. Brennan contacted Wolf because he knew about the doctor's work with Apache veterans. The conversation between them, documented in Wolf's notes, reveals both men's growing fear that something inexplicable was happening. Brennan showed me photographs from the scene. The marks are identical to those described in Unit 17's classified reports. But here is what makes no sense. All of the Apache veterans with knowledge of these symbols are accounted for. None were near the Superstition Mountains. None had any connection to the victims. Brennan asked if I thought the German ghosts the veterans talk about could be real. I told him that was impossible. But even as I said it, I wondered, if you traumatize a place deeply enough, if you kill in that place with enough rage and ritual, does something remain? Do the dead truly rest? Or do they linger, learning, growing, becoming something new? The killings continued sporadically through the 1930s. Hikers, prospectors, ranchers, all found dead in remote areas of Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. All killed with the same precision. All marked with the same symbols. The cases were never connected officially because different jurisdictions handled each incident, and in the 1930s, there was no centralized system for identifying patterns across state lines. But, in 1935, something happened that could not be ignored. Vittorio Eschiminzin, the warrior who had led some of Unit 17's most brutal raids in France, was found dead in his home on the San Carlos Reservation. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by knife. But the details, preserved in Dr. Wolf's notes, tell a very different story. December 1935. I was called to Eschiminzin's home yesterday. What I saw there will haunt me until I die. He had been killed with the same technique he himself had perfected, the same swift throat opening that left no time for sound or struggle. But it was the symbol on his forehead that stopped my heart. It was not one of the Apache marks. It was something else, something hybrid. A combination of German military insignia and Apache war symbols, merged into a single mark that seemed to pulse with malevolence, even in death. On the wall, written in blood, were words in both German and Apache. The German roughly translated to, "We learned from you." The Apache translated to, "Your hate is ours now." I believe Eschiminzin was killed by what he helped create. The ghosts he cursed. The spirits he marked and bound to hatred. They learned from him, and then they killed him with his own knowledge. Following Eschiminzin's death, the remaining veterans of Unit 17 began dying at an accelerated rate. By 1940, only 16 were still alive. By the time World War II ended in 1945, only 7 remained. All of them refused to speak about their service. All of them lived in constant fear. All of them died before they reached the age of 60. The last surviving member of Unit 17 was a warrior named Thomas Cochise, grandson of the famous chief. He lived until 1968, dying at the age of 74 in a nursing home in Tucson. A social worker named Ellen Ramirez was with him during his final hours. She recorded his last words, not understanding their significance until years later when she learned about Unit 17's history. "He kept saying the same thing over and over," Ramirez wrote in her report. "We should not have marked them. We should not have bound them. We made them into us, but we forgot that hate learns. Hate adapts. Hate spreads. It is in the land now, in the bones of the earth. Every battlefield where Apache died, every place where rage was swallowed instead of released, it is there, waiting. And the German spirits we marked, they are still here too, still learning, still growing, becoming more Apache than we are. They are the hate we could have been if we had never been defeated. They are what we denied ourselves when we accepted the reservation. They are us, but free. And they are angry at us for stopping, for giving up, for making peace." Dr. Patricia Chenot's research into Unit 17 ended abruptly in 1994 when she disappeared during a research trip to Arizona. She had been investigating reports of unusual markings found in caves near the site of the Battle of Big Dry Wash. Her rental car was found abandoned on a forest road. Her body was never recovered. Her laptop and research materials were never found. The only clue to her fate was a single photograph, taken by an automatic camera she had set up in one of the caves. The photograph, which was recovered by search teams, shows the interior of the cave at night. The image is grainy and partially obscured, but clearly visible are symbols carved into the cave wall, the same symbols Unit 17 used in France. Surrounding these symbols are newer carvings, words in German and Apache, dates ranging from the 1920s through the 1990s. And in the foreground, barely visible in the darkness, is a figure, human-shaped but somehow wrong. The Park Service classified the photograph and closed the cave system permanently, citing structural instability. But the reports have not stopped. Every year, hikers in Arizona and New Mexico report strange encounters in areas where Apache warriors once fought. They describe seeing figures in the distance that vanish when approached. They find symbols carved into trees, into rocks, into the earth itself. They hear voices mixing German and Apache words, chanting things that should not be possible to understand, but somehow convey pure, distilled rage. In 2009, a group of German tourists visiting Apache historical sites in Arizona reported a terrifying experience. They were photographing Skeleton Canyon, where Geronimo surrendered in 1886, when they heard chanting. The words were in German, but the rhythm was Native American. They fled to their vehicle and drove back to Tucson immediately. When they developed their photographs, they found images they did not remember taking, pictures of symbols carved into canyon walls, pictures of shadows that looked like human forms, and in one photograph, clearly visible on a rock face, words in German, "Wir vergessen nie. Wir vergeben nie." We never forget. We never forgive. The local Apache communities do not talk about these incidents publicly, but privately, the elders know. They teach the young people to avoid certain areas, to never camp alone in places where the old battles happened, to respect the boundaries between the living and what lies beyond. And they warn about Unit 17, about what happens when you give hate permission to exist, when you formalize rage into ritual, when you mark the dead with symbols that bind rather than release. One elder, who agreed to speak with a journalist in 2015 on condition of anonymity, said something that captures the true horror of what Unit 17 created. Our ancestors fought with honor. They fought for survival. When they died, they were released. Their spirits found peace. But the men of Unit 17 did not fight for survival. They fought to make others feel what we felt. They turned killing into revenge ritual. They cursed the spirits of the dead. And in doing so, they cursed themselves. They cursed the land. They created ghosts that have no peace, that can never have peace, because they were specifically marked to remain in eternal rage. And those ghosts are still here, still learning, still hungry, still adding to their count. The United States military still refuses to declassify the complete operational history of Special Reconnaissance Unit 17. Official explanations cite ongoing security concerns and protection of intelligence-gathering techniques. But there are those who believe the real reason is much darker. That buried in those classified files are reports from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and beyond. Reports of supernatural incidents connected to the unit. Reports of symbols appearing in places no living person could have accessed. Reports of German military equipment found in Arizona deserts decades after the war ended. Reports that, if made public, would force acknowledgement that something was unleashed during World War I that never stopped, that cannot be stopped, that grows stronger with each passing year. Captain Robert Mackenzie was right to be afraid. The hate did not stop when the target was gone. It could not stop because it had been ritualized, formalized, given structure and symbol and purpose. It had been transformed from emotion into entity, from feeling into force. And forces, once set in motion, do not simply dissipate. They continue. They adapt. They find new expressions. Today, if you visit the San Carlos Apache Reservation, if you talk quietly with the elders, if you prove yourself trustworthy, you might hear stories. Stories about the warriors who went to France. Stories about what they did in the trenches of Europe. Stories about what they brought back. And stories about what continues, even now, in the canyons and mountains where Apache blood soaked into the earth over a century ago. You might hear about hikers who disappear and are never found, about symbols that appear on rocks overnight, about voices in languages that should not exist together, chanting hatred that transcends culture and time, about figures seen in twilight that move like warriors but leave no tracks, about places where compasses spin uselessly and electronics fail and people feel an overwhelming urge to run without knowing why. You might hear about researchers who become obsessed with Unit 17 and then vanish, about military historians who request classified files and then withdraw their requests, pale and shaken, about German visitors who come to Apache lands seeking to understand World War I history and leave immediately, refusing to explain what they experienced. And you might hear the warnings. Do not go to the old battlefields alone. Do not camp in places where warriors died. Do not try to photograph the symbols if you find them. Do not attempt to research Unit 17 too deeply. Do not speak the names of the dead without proper respect. And above all, never, ever try to understand the hate. Because hate that old, that deep, that carefully preserved and ritualized is not meant to be understood. It is meant to be feared. The Apache people know this. They have known it since the last veteran died. They have known it since the first report of German ghosts in Apache lands. They have known it since Victorio Escaminsin was found with his throat opened by his own technique, marked with symbols that merged two people's rage into something entirely new. They know that Unit 17's mission is not over, that the war continues in ways the generals never imagined, that somewhere in the borderlands between Arizona and New Mexico, in the canyons where ancient battles were fought and lost, something walks, something that was human once, in two different times, in two different wars, Something that carries memories of trenches and reservations, of gas attacks and forced marches, of German villages and Apache camps. Something that marks the living as the dead were marked. Something that counts and never finds the total sufficient. Something that whispers in two languages about debts that can never be paid, about rage that can never be satisfied, about hate that has transcended its origins and become eternal. The official story says Unit 17 was disbanded in 1919. The official story says all members returned home and lived normal lives. The official story says their service, while unusual, was ultimately just another example of Native American contributions to American military efforts. But the truth, whispered in Apache lands, documented in sealed files, carved into canyon walls where no one goes anymore, is very different. The truth is that Unit 17 never disbanded. It transformed. It evolved. It became something that exists between the living and the dead, between history and legend, between two people's darkest memories. And it is still out there, still marking, still counting, still teaching its hate to anyone foolish enough to listen, still waiting for those who would seek to understand what happens when you give ancient rage modern purpose, when you bind spirits to eternal anger, when you make ghosts that cannot rest because they were specifically created to never rest. In the end, perhaps that is Unit 17's true legacy. Not the German soldiers they killed, not the battles they won, not the fear they spread, but the reminder that some hatreds are too deep to heal, too old to die, too powerful to contain. That when you take generations of pain and focus it into ritual violence, you create something that outlives its creators. Something that becomes part of the land itself. Something that waits in the darkness of canyons and caves, patient and eternal, counting its marks and whispering its rage in two languages to anyone who will listen. The warriors of Unit 17 are all dead now, but their creation lives, and it is growing, learning, adapting, becoming something new while remaining something impossibly old. A fusion of Apache warfare and European death, of reservation grief and trench horror, of two people's darkest capabilities merged into a single, eternal expression of hate. They say on quiet nights in Arizona, if you listen carefully in the places where warriors died, you can hear them counting, in German and Apache, counting coup that never ends, counting debts that can never be settled, counting a tally that grows with every year, every decade, every generation. And they say the count is not finished, that it will never be finished, that Unit 17's war continues, hidden from history but burned into the land, carried in the wind that blows through desert canyons, whispered in the darkness where symbols glow with malevolence and ghosts that should not exist teach their rage to the earth itself. This is the true story of Unit 17, not the one in the history books, not the one in the official records, but the one that lives in the land, the one that continues, the one that will not end. Because hate, when it is old enough, deep enough, ritualized enough, does not die. It transforms. It waits. And when the conditions are right, when someone new feels similar rage, when the land itself resonates with accumulated pain, it emerges again, teaching, spreading, growing. Unit 17 taught us that some weapons cannot be controlled, that some forces, once summoned, cannot be dismissed, that the ghosts we create to punish our enemies may turn on us instead, may outlive us, may become something we never intended but always feared. And in that fear, in that recognition of what we are capable of creating when we formalize our darkest impulses, perhaps there is a lesson a warning. A reminder that the true horror is not what was done in France during those blood-soaked months of 1918. The true horror is what continues now, in our own lands, born from our own rage, marked with our own symbols. In times like these, when darkness seems overwhelming and hate appears justified, we must remember that there is a path away from this eternal cycle. A path that our ancestors knew but we have forgotten. A path that requires us to release the hate rather than ritualize it, to seek peace rather than revenge, to trust in something greater than our own rage. That path leads to God, to Jesus Christ, to a love that can transform what hate cannot touch. For only in divine grace can the cycle truly be broken. Only in forgiveness can the ghosts finally rest. Only in faith can we escape the count that never ends. The choice is ours. The choice has always been ours. But the land remembers what we choose, and the land never forgets.